When we recognize certain patterns in ufology, we recognize they are continuous till this day. The most extraordinary explanations for events are brought up front, but the background stories are never researched. There is always emphasis on the shiny object, as James Carrion would say. Unknown objects and unexplained stories are maybe only unexplained for the public. No explanations from government, military, and intelligence community promote extraordinary explanations in the name of secrecy. The media doesn't help either, promoting bombastic and spectacular for the same reasons of secrecy or for the views. To locate the start of the patterns, we have to go back in history before the Foo Fighters and flying saucers existed. The patterns were recycled in different forms and for different uses, but it seems it all started in Los Angeles in 1942. First, we have to look at the historical facts so we can better understand the circumstances that led to the Battle of LA. On December the 7th, 1941, Japanese Empire makes a devastating attack on a Pearl Harbor base on Oahu, Hawaii, declaring war on United States. 270 SCR radar detects the Japanese bombers. Two guys reported to Information Center, where they misidentified the planes for B-17s scheduled to arrive from California. So we can see how important are detection, preparedness, and air defense. Also, on the 7th December 1941, false report of a Japanese submarine being spotted 30 miles off the coast. Although that was false information, Japanese submarine attacks cargo freighter, lumber cargo freighter Cynthia approximately 350 miles off the coast. All those events were a little bit of a shocker for the West Coast population, so the anxiety, fear of imminent Japanese attack began. Suddenly Hawaii was much closer to the West Coast than it was before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The word was spreading in coming weeks and months about dangers of Japan conquering nearby islands like Aleutian Islands near Alaska. These islands would have been good strategical position for Japanese bombing attacks on the West Coast. There was also fear of aircrafts being launched from submarines and carriers. In Chapter 8, Air Defenses of the Western Hemisphere by William Goss, from the book The Army Air Forces in World War II, Volume 1. As early as 8th December, the Navy reported that the losses sustained in Hawaii had left the Pacific Fleet unable to carry out the tasks assigned to it in the existing war plan. And the next day, Secretary Stimson reported to President Roosevelt that the War Department plan for the defense of the Pacific coast has been based on the security provided by Hawaii and the fleet, and that the present attack has left the West Coast unprotected. Well, Secretary Stimson's worries maybe weren't too exaggerated. On 13th December, Japanese Imperial General Headquarters ordered the submarine of the 6th Fleet to bombard the United States West Coast. The 6th Fleet's commander, Vice Admiral Mitsumi Shimizu, in turn ordered I-9 and submarines I-10, I-15, I-17, I-19, I-21, I-23, I-25 and I-26, each to fire 30 rounds at targets on the US West Coast on the evening of 25th December. By the end of December 1941, Japanese managed to strike 3 American ships. Japanese Navy submarine sunk 2 tankers on 20th and 23rd of December. The other one was another lumber freighter that they torpedoed on 24th. There were other attacks, but ships managed to escape with some or no damage. In those months, Japanese submarines were regularly patrolling around the west coast. In a period of 10 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and also longer, as we will see, there were a lot of rumors and reports of dates of Japanese attacks, invasions, sabotages. Many reports came from Japanese Americans living on the west coast. They were informants for military and intelligence, called Nisei, were second-generation Japanese Americans living in the United States. To quote one article, realizing that this made the Nisei unlikely saboteurs, J. Edgar Hoover and other officials instructed their agents to cultivate informants within the Japanese-American community. Togo Tanaka, unofficial historian of the Japanese American Citizens League, claimed that federal investigators made personal contact with national officers of the JACL between 1940 and 1941, while chapter leaders were increasingly approached by both federal and local law enforcement. Yet some Nisei were recruited in military intelligence service unit, but their recruitment was shown as very good move later on in the Pacific War. But the unit was still in its infancy in the first months after Pearl Harbor. We already mentioned 3 Japanese submarine attacks in December 1941, but the event that really raised levels of panic and hysteria through the roof was the Elwood oil field incident on the Gaviota coast near Santa Barbara. It happened on 23rd February 1942, just the day before the Great Los Angeles Air Raid, also known as Battle of Los Angeles. Around 7 p.m., Japanese submarine I-17 opened fire at the fuel tanks at Elwood oil field. Some estimate that it fired about 15 explosive shells, but the submarine missed the targets and caused minimal damage or very light damage. Submarine submerged and managed to escape. I-17 submarine captain Nishino was a former tanker captain. He had very good prior knowledge of the coast. The event caused such a havoc that some people even escaped inland in fear of full-scale invasion. The Elwood incident was first of a kind in Second World War, where United States mainland was attacked, and it happened just the day before the Battle of Los Angeles. Now we're gonna look at the document called The History of the 4th AA Command, Western Defense Command, from January 9th, 1942 to July 1st, 1945. It is an authentic official document and is broadly referred to by researchers in case of Battle of Los Angeles incident. We're gonna look at the 32-page extract of the 4th Anti-Aircraft Command History, Chapter 5, titled Defense Operations on the West Coast. Section 1 is titled The Battle of Los Angeles. First few pages are about reports and rumors of Japanese attacks. To summarize, anti-aircraft defenses of the West Coast were on almost continuous alert. Attacks were expected at Seattle and other Pacific Coast cities. Many rumors were that Japs would bomb these cities on various dates. A Jap informant in Los Angeles reported to Headquarters 11th Naval District, rumor among Japanese families, that on 18 February the West Coast would be bombed. A report to Headquarters 39th Brigade Seattle from G2, Northwestern Sector, Western Defense Command on 13th February stated, Japs will bomb West Coast on 18th February. Many such reports after Pearl Harbor. From 7th to 15th February was the first one in which attacks accompanied by sabotage were expected. Based on a GHQ dispatch, General Headquarters dispatch, from General Marshall on 19th February, between 15th February and 15th March, General DeWitt extended the alert warning to cover that period. It continues. Around 1800 on 23rd February, a friendly Japanese reported that a rumor was current among Japanese residents of Los Angeles that an attack would occur that night. An hour later, 1905, a Jap submarine surfaced off the coast at Elwood, California. And it goes on with the summary and estimation of the Elwood incident. We will return to this document, but what is interesting to mention is that President Roosevelt had a fireside chat 20 on 23rd February 1942 at 10:30 p.m., but supposedly recorded it 2.5 hours before, at approximately same time the Elwood incident was happening, where he mentioned vulnerabilities of the West Coast to a Japanese attack. We have to say a few words about General John L. DeWitt, man in charge of Western Defense Command. He was the main proponent of the idea that Japanese and Japanese Americans should be removed from the West Coast after Pearl Harbor. After all, most of the Japanese Americans lived on the West Coast. DeWitt was afraid that they would collaborate with the enemy and stage sabotages. After Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 on the 19th February 42, over 100,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated into relocation centers, which were basically camps. As Chief of Western Defense Command, he was responsible of defending the whole West Coast and its important infrastructure and facilities. He was a very important figure in the event of Battle of Los Angeles. Before we tackle the LA incident itself, we ought to mention a few things about city blackouts. The British started implementing city blackouts in 1939 and more intensely after London Blitz in 1940. First city in United States that had an air raid blackout drill was Seattle in March 1941. And after Pearl Harbor, coastal areas, especially western coast, had a mandatory obligation of blackout practice. Absolutely all city lights had to be turned off, with air raid wardens, civilian volunteers, checking the sky with their binoculars, checking that all lights in houses and apartments are turned off, etc. On 24th February at 7:18 p.m., 24 hours after Elwood oilfield attack occurred, things started happening when the radio stations announced yellow alert. We're going to jump back to historical report History of the 4th Anti-Aircraft Command, Chapter 5, Section 1. Naval Intelligence at Los Angeles reported at 1900 on the evening of 24th February that an attack could be expected during the next 10 hours, and from that time on, 37th Brigade headquarters received a very large number of reports of flares and blinking lights near the defense plants and oil fields, and the 4th Interceptor Command put the coast from Monterey to Mexican border on yellow alert. Intensities or levels of alerts were categorized by color. White basically meant there is no alert. Yellow was first level, blue was second, red was third and fourth, green was the highest level of alertness. Jim Lewis, Second World War historian, lecturer and Battle of Los Angeles researcher, said in one of his presentations that under General DeWitt's leadership, Los Angeles populace was so used of blackouts that LA Times coined it City of Shadows. Blackouts were sometimes ordered up to several times a week. When these alerts reached red level status, they triggered air raid alarms, blackout, radio silence, and they sent thousands of air wardens and auxiliary police to the streets. Anti-aircraft guns were manned and searchlights were on. Lewis concluded, this was Hollywood. and we will explain a little bit more why this is the case in part 3. At 10:23 p.m., alert was reverted back to white, so all clear. Until 1:44 a.m., an SCR-268 radar picked up an unidentifiable aerial target, confirmed by two SCR-270 radars. At 2 o'clock there appeared on the Information Center's operation board an unidentified target 120 miles west of Los Angeles, well tracked by radar by First Lieutenant Kenneth R. Martin. Well, this is very peculiar or doubtful. SCR-268 radar was a gun lane radar or fire control radar, also used for guiding searchlights. Its maximum detection distance, as determined by the pulse interval, was 22 miles. So it's hardly likely this radar detected an object at distance of 120 miles. Although two SCR-270s that supposedly confirmed the primary detection were long-range radars, capable of detection up to 140-150 miles. 6 minutes after Information Center was notified, so at 2 a.m., the radar blip was officially declared unidentified aircraft approaching, with yellow alert called, according to historian Jim Lewis. The historical report states that from this point on till 2:27, so for 21 minutes, the object was tracked to within 3 miles of the Los Angeles area. And here we have another peculiar situation. The fact that the military let unknown aircraft fly so close to the Los Angeles area without sending any interception fighters in the middle of the war, one day after Elwood attack, suggests the possibility that at this point the military knew what was going on. In the middle of tracking at 2:15, Blue Alert was called, according to Jim Lewis, and at the same time anti-aircraft batteries were alerted, according to historical report. At 2:21, regional controller ordered a blackout. In next 10 minutes, anti-aircraft batteries were put on green alert status. Jim Lewis explains that approximately 10 minutes after Blue Alert was called, the Red Alert was called, and additional 2 radars confirmed the object. By that, it's not clear if he refers to long-range radars which are mentioned in the report. Lewis adds that soon after, another blackout was imposed. It happened after sirens woke up at least 1 million residents in Southern California. And at the same time, Green Alert was called. Also, radio communication silence was ordered. From this point on, the real party started. From this time on, the wires were hot with reports of flights of enemy planes. At 2:43, the gun officer reported unidentified planes between Seal Beach and Long Beach. At 3:06, a balloon carrying a red flare was reported over Santa Monica and firing on it by batteries B, C, and D of the 65th and battery B of the 205th began at 3:07 on orders of the controller to destroy it. A total of 482 rounds of 3-inch shells were expended at the planes and dirigible without visible result, except Gun 3E3 reported setting one plane on fire. Simply put, Battery B detected a balloon over Santa Monica and started shooting on it. All the other batteries engaged in shooting on planes, and one plane was set on fire. What we need to emphasize here is that the batteries were turned inland towards Los Angeles City and Los Angeles area and were not shooting at the unidentified object while it was still at sea or offshore. Also, no interceptors were sent to inspect the unidentified objects. First time anti-aircraft units report shooting at planes. As we can see, firing was initially triggered by a balloon. We will expand a little bit more on this in part 3. 20 minutes later, one battery spotted 25 to 30 heavy bombers over the Douglas plant. 5 minutes later, 15 planes were seen flying over Artesia and 581 rounds of 3-inch shells and 38 rounds of 37mm shells were expended on them by 8 batteries. And the planes supposedly just flew over to the sea. At 3:55, another balloon was spotted yet again over Santa Monica, and 100 rounds were fired upon it. We can see a lot of reporting and action in that area where camouflaged Douglas aircraft plant was stationed. It's good to keep this information on mind for later on. Brian Palmer of CBS Radio reported that the unidentified object, which some sources thought might be a blimp, moved slowly down the Pacific coast from Santa Monica and disappeared south of Long Beach. Ship returned and headed westward from Long Beach to Santa Monica. Both times, anti-aircraft guns were firing at it. Some witnesses thought that the object or objects might have been escaped barrage balloons, which was very common in Los Angeles area, while others insisted the objects were much larger than that. CBS radio reporter stated that the unidentified object just vanished both times after it was fired upon it. This is where the story merges unidentified flying object, or we can say radar blimp, detected 120 miles off the coast with the later identified 2 balloons. But the reports of planes kept on coming till after 6 a.m. One report claiming 6 planes were shot down. At 4:55, another report was claiming that Douglas aircraft plant was bombed but suffered no hits. And yet, still not a single fighter was launched by 4th Interceptor Command. At 6:35, quote, Hollywood lighted up like a Christmas tree. 10 minutes later, alert was reverted to red because friendly flights were scheduled to leave the area. After 7 o'clock, it was too bright for the searchlights, so the blackout was lifted altogether. 1,401 of M3 3-inch rounds and 39 of 37mm rounds were fired, with no evidence of any kind of enemy aircraft, bombers, shells or bombs anywhere to be found, with no witnesses after the incident who would have seen the consequences and proof of those targets on the ground right after the event, even though tens or hundreds of thousands of people were awake and watching. But let's see what was found. Jim Lewis states that 10 tons of metal, meaning anti-aircraft unit shell remainings, fell to the ground. Some shells didn't explode until they hit something, blowing up some windows and damaging some cars. When shell fragments and shrapnels were falling from the sky, some people, like late-night workers, escaped to shelters. Some fragments penetrated interiors of houses. 3 people died in car accidents because of blackout. 2 people died from heart attacks after the panic started. And interesting, only 2 people reported injuries from shells. Immediately after the event, the media in Los Angeles were critical of the event. There was discussion about congressional hearings, but media on the national level, also some media from the Los Angeles area, were bombastic. Examples of some article titles: LA area raided, or Guns bombard sky as strange planes blackout Southland in first raid, and Air battle rages over Los Angeles. And reporting like city was on fire, Douglas aircraft plant and Long Beach had been bombed. Some newspapers reported that the attack did in fact occur and that the US government was guilty of a cover-up. One more example from Los Angeles Times. Roaring out of a brilliant moonlit western sky, foreign aircraft flying both in large formation and singly flew over Southern California early today and drew heavy barrages of anti-aircraft fire, the first ever to sound over United States continental soil against an enemy invader. But what about the famous saucer-shaped picture released in the newspapers? Historian Jim Lewis stated that it is incredible how only one photojournalist was let to take the picture. It was and is the only picture taken from the object. It was later acknowledged that the photo was retouched by newspaper artists. Many researchers played with the contrast of the picture from the original negative, such as Bruce Maccabee. When brightness reduced and contrast enhanced, it shows a smaller object above the searchlights. The theory goes it's a reflection of the object. But does it show a smaller saucer shape, or does it reveal a balloon? We cannot claim with certainty because the photograph doesn't reveal the facts. After supposedly unretouched version of the photo was released in 2011. The post original doesn't show enormous difference. Some used the new photo for the argument that it proved it was not a balloon, but in fact it revealed nothing. The discussion about the photo is going on for decades, but let's return to the newspapers. So we see this relationship between army actions and media reporting. Here's an example from 10th December, 3 months before. Army reported that they were tracking planes approaching west coast from 100 miles at sea. General DeWitt stated following: "Last night there were planes over this community. They were enemy planes. I mean Japanese planes, and they were tracked out to sea. You think it was a hoax? It is damned nonsense for sensible people to assume that the Army and Navy would practice such a hoax on San Francisco." End quote. And newspapers reported these statements with headlines like, quote, "Army warns city danger near," unquote. Data is again from the Army Air Forces in World War II, Chapter 8, Air Defenses of the Western Hemisphere by William Goss. Other theories included that the Japanese were firing at targets in Los Angeles from secret bases in northern Mexico, or that the incident may have been staged or exaggerated to give coastal defense industries an excuse to sell more anti-aircraft weapons. So what about civilian witnesses? Historical report states that several civilians testified the 7 to 8 planes they saw were very high and looked like birds in the searchlight beams. Perhaps they were. One police officer reported seeing 2 aircrafts in combat. Some claimed they saw clusters of 3 or 4 flares being sent up into the sky. A civilian saw some of them flares lighted in a vacant lot, and since his name was learned, the FBI was investigating. In very interesting, very well made deep dive article titled The Battle of Los Angeles, a historical mystery of UFOs, possible military cover-ups, and the American psyche, author Jeremy McGowan quotes 7 statements from 7 different witnesses as written in Los Angeles Times in the days right after the event. I saw 3 planes flying in formation over Westwood. Then a 4th joined them. The searchlights were playing on them, and you could plainly see their outlines against the sky. Then they turned and came in this direction. That's when the shooting started, said James Peoples in Los Angeles Times on 26th February. There was no doubt about it. It was a plane, a big one, and it was hovering slowly and noiselessly over the ocean. It was a fearsome thing to watch. We were all paralyzed with fright, said William H. Spalding in Los Angeles Times on 26th February. We went to the window and saw a brilliant red object. It was clearly visible against the background of the blackout city. It was moving slowly across the sky towards the sea. Then it turned and seemed to come straight at us. It was a huge thing, cylindrical in shape, with brilliant spots of light all over it. We were terrified and dived for cover under the dining room table, said Mrs. Henry Reinhardt in Los Angeles Times 26th February. All of a sudden, there was a tremendous explosion and a flare shot into the sky. We could see a plane right over our heads. Then there were more explosions and more flares. The noise was terrific. It was very much like the opening barrage in a barrage balloon. It lasted about an hour, said Lily Hayden, a resident of Culver City, in Los Angeles Times on 26th February. We were sure it was an enemy plane. It was flying very low, about 2,000 feet, and we could see its markings plainly. It was not one of our planes. We knew that right away. Sergeant Charles L. Banbury in Los Angeles Times, also on 26th February. I saw planes in the sky, 3 of them. They seemed to be coming in this direction. There was a great deal of shooting and the sky was lit up with the flashes from the anti-aircraft guns, said Howard W. Smith in Los Angeles Times, 26th February. We saw the shells exploding around the object in the sky. We watched for some time and then we went back to bed. Later we heard the all-clear signal and went to sleep again. From Mrs. C. W. Stewart in Long Beach Independent newspapers on 25th February 1942. Yet some witnesses couldn't distinguish what kind of planes they saw. Many thought they saw American planes, but some witnesses reported hearing the planes, hearing the sound of planes. On the website psychologytoday.com, in the article titled Eyewitness Processes at the Battle of Los Angeles, author Matthew J. Sharps, Ph.D., wrote following: Brigadier General Frank Dorn tells us that after Pearl Harbor, many Californians saw Japanese aircraft flying overhead, but the planes weren't Japanese. They were in fact products of a local aircraft plant, flown east out of the potential combat zone. To avoid bureaucratic complications, the plant supervisor hadn't reported this to anybody. Frank Warren, publisher, editor and writer at the UFO Chronicles, described his own experience of the event on the same site, the UFO Chronicles. Article is long, so I will extract the most important parts. At the time of his experience, he was with his mother. They lived in Hermosa Beach, California. He wrote, "The planes we'd heard were not in sight, but what captured our rapt attention was a silvery, lozenge-shaped bug, as my mother later described it, that was clearly visible in the searchlight beams that pinpointed it. Although it was a clear moonlit night, no other details could be discerned, despite the fact that, when we first saw it, the object was hanging motionless almost directly overhead." He also writes, "However, between shell bursts, the craft emitted no sound whatsoever, nor was it acting aggressively. As we watched, open-mouthed, the object, apparently none the worse for the plethora of rounds directed at it, began to move slowly to the southeast, descending over Redondo Beach, where we lost sight of it." The article was published on 25th October 2006. There's another witness. C. Scott Littleton, an honored professor of anthropology at Occidental College. His research interests include the occult and the paranormal, especially the folkloric and mythological implications of the UFO phenomenon. His testimony came out to the public also decades after the event. When he experienced the event, he was with his late mother. They also lived in Hermosa Beach at the time. "While my father went about his air raid warden duties, my late mother and I watched the glowing object, which was caught in the glare of searchlights from both Palos Verdes and Malibu Pacific Palisades and surrounded by the puffs of ineffectual anti-aircraft fire, as it slowly flew across the ocean from northwest to southeast." Description of the object. "In any case, I don't recall seeing any truly discernible configuration, just a small, glowing, slight lozenge-shaped blob light, a single blob. We only saw one object, not several as some witnesses later reported." We can see not only the similar story, but also the same words used. There are other elements also that are the same, like they both picked up next day the remains of the shells that fell to the ground. We can see clearly signs of reconstruction of the story which came decades after the event. Only later I found out the two witnesses were collaborators at the UFO Chronicles website, fellow ufologists, so to speak. There is supposedly another witness, William Stout. You can hear more about his experience at YouTube Sci-Fi channel, in their documentary about the incident. Another witness that goes by the initials HC also supposedly wrote his testimony. I will extract only the important. Quote, "I could have been 2 or 3 or up to 6 miles away. I can't recall exactly since it occurred so long ago, but I strongly remember the searchlights converging on the bottoms of the reddish objects flying in formation. I have no doubt there are many more similar stories like these, which come decades after the incident. This is a pattern in ufology, and we can recognize it through its all modern history." We're going to wrap up the event part with some statements from military and officials. Colonel Henry C. Davis, executive officer and acting commander of the 37th Brigade, thought for a few minutes that he saw from 10 to 15 planes over Inglewood, but soon decided it was drifting smoke from anti-aircraft bursts. He did not believe any planes at all were present. Lieutenant Buchanan saw from 20 to 30 planes over the city from the roof of his hotel at 8th and Flower. Colonel Watson saw a balloon but discovered the meteorological laboratory had sent up a balloon. He ordered the units of his command to hold their fire. Captain Mulder saw lights pick up a meteorological balloon and firing commenced upon it. Captain Cohen identified the balloon as a meteorological one when it was illuminated by the searchlights. Captain Bailey searched with his SCR-268 at the intersection of the searchlight but got nothing. Lieutenant Gaines could find no target with his binoculars and his SCR-268 radar gave anything. Sergeant Bowman saw 5 planes with his naked eye at 30,000 feet. He saw them illuminated by 15 to 20 searchlights. Lieutenant Miles with glasses saw a V of 3 planes at 9,000 feet that flew 2 courses. Lieutenant Handz saw a V of 3 planes at 9,000 feet, but his SCR-268 radar picked up nothing. Lieutenant Anderson at the Douglas plant at Long Beach saw a plane, and a few minutes later he saw a flight of 3 planes through his binoculars. Lieutenant Bendixson and 2 of his men counted 14 planes flying high and slow. Private Gaylor saw a flight of 5 planes in a V and a battery fired on them. Captain Hyde saw 2 flights of 6 planes each. Colonel Barshong saw a wedge of 3 planes. This one is really interesting. Around 8:30, 1 hour after blackout was lifted, Colonel Phillips reported 3 Coast Guard planes were up all night, flying in an oval 40 miles apart offshore. Approximately 1 hour later, Phillips reported again that he was misinformed and that the Coast Guard planes had not made the scheduled flight. General Fickle reported that some witnesses were claiming that they had seen as high as 50 planes. But Fickle believed that one target was 2 meteorological balloons released by anti-aircraft units near Hollywood and that probably from 1 to 5 planes did fly over Los Angeles. General DeWitt stated that there were probably 1 to 5 planes in the air which were possibly launched from Japanese submarines, but more likely civilian flyers. He added that military has to do everything to identify the perpetrators. Secretary Stimson stated to LA Times that there were 15 commercial planes and the army had the rights to fire upon them. Historian Jim Lewis points out another statement from Secretary Stimson. He said that the planes were probably launched from a Japanese aircraft carrier to detect and surveil anti-aircraft units on the West Coast. Quite imaginative from Secretary Stimson, saying 15 commercial planes being launched from aircraft carrier and piloted by enemies. And the Secretary of the Navy Knox held there were no planes over the city and that the anti-aircraft units had just had a case of explicable nerve jitters, which had unfortunately resulted in a bombardment which was indirectly responsible for 6 deaths and considerable property damage. The 4th Air Force stated that they believe there were no planes over Los Angeles. And William Goss wrote that the 4th Interceptor Command stated they were preferring to await indications of the scale and direction of any attack before committing its limited fighter force, when responding to the question why they remained out of action throughout the incident. So these kind of statements and ambiguity immediately made certain groups conclude that it was an alien attack. It is also a beginning of an idea of alien visitation cover-up conspiracy. In a way, the seeds for this kind of conspiracy were planted. When we're talking about idea of alien cover-up conspiracy in case of Battle of Los Angeles, we must not look at it chronologically, despite of a fact that alien attack or alien invasion idea was already planted in the United States citizens' minds by Orson Welles in 1933 in his radio show. Although it happened in 1942, 5 years before Roswell and Kenneth Arnold sighting. Some researchers have managed to gather evidence that ufology was deliberately used for psychological warfare purposes, and we can see that the incidents known as the Battle of Los Angeles, Foo Fighters, and ghost rockets were incorporated into the ufological myth much later. Despite the fact that they took place in 1942, 1945, and 1946. James Carrion is an independent researcher. James served for 4 years as a US Army Russian linguist in the Military Intelligence Corps. Later, he was International Director of MUFON, Mutual UFO Network. Although he meets all the requirements to be one of those people that manipulate and create ufology, he argues a totally different story. Researcher James Carrion formulated a hypothesis that involves strategic deception in cases of ghost rockets, and specifically Kenneth Arnold and Roswell incidents. But that doesn't seem to be the case in Battle of Los Angeles event. Evidence suggests that it was more of an immediate cover-up story for the public. But the idea that extraterrestrials were responsible for the Los Angeles event was nevertheless already present. Present as an idea, present as a belief. But the idea of extraterrestrial involvement in Los Angeles battle as a cover-up was not used at the time. The idea came into the discussion much later. That is because after Roswell mythology didn't yet exist. Extraterrestrial propaganda started in 1947. Those unexplained incidents show us the patterns that linked unexplained with alien cover-up conspiracy idea. Gathering information by filing FOIA requests is the most prominent way of gathering information from the government for ufologists. After Watergate scandal, FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, was for the first time seriously improved by amendments in 1974 and 1976. This resulted in flood of information, disinformation, dubious information, classified information in the name of national security, etc. For the ufology, it was a birth of new conspiracies, new theories, new events, and documentation. It triggered a totally new wave in military entertainment industry, as Mark Pilkington would say. That laid basis for ufological mythology, which we can recognize today in ufology and media. As always, the wave came in entertainment and official manners, which then mix together. Here are examples of what it looks like coordinated expansion of the topic. In 1977, Hollywood produces a movie titled Close Encounters of the Third Kind, directed by Steven Spielberg, with help of UFO experts J. Allen Hynek and Jacques Vallée. In 1977 and 1978, at the request of Grenada, General Assembly of United Nations considered establishment of an agency or department of the United Nations for undertaking, coordinating and disseminating the result of research into unidentified flying objects and related phenomena. Draft resolutions sponsored by Grenada in each session were not pressed to vote and were not adopted. As written on the UN's site, Grenada was represented by ufologists like Leonard Stringfield, J. Allen Hynek, Lee Spiegel, and Jacques Vallée. In 1978, UFO Roswell lore started with Stanton Friedman interviewing Jesse Marcel for the first time. After 30 years, long-forgotten Roswell incident started to expand with new stories about gray aliens and launched crash retrieval and reverse engineering myths. Also in 1978, famous MUFON convention where ufologist Leonard Stringfield presented his, quote, research, unquote, about witnesses of alien bodies, grays. A documentary that had a huge impact on the subculture was re-released in 1979, titled UFOs, Past, Present and Future. In 1980, first book about the Roswell incident was released, titled The Roswell Incident by William Moore and Charles Berlitz. And it went on with accumulating data. In next 10 to 15 years, ufology expanded with all kinds of books, insider witnesses, insider information, documentation, movies and documentaries. New areas such as psychic phenomena merged with ufology, as well as cattle mutilations, abductions, etc. In the context of ufology, these topics have gradually moved from subculture into the mainstream over a period of time. Although contact groups formed already in 1950s, psychic phenomena such as remote viewing tries to merge with abductions and contact experiences in 1970s. By that I mean it came to mainstream and shows, and connections between topics were intentionally reinforced. The UFO wave was guided by individuals collaborating with government agencies, working for government, working for contractors, or connected with the government and agencies, or research and development, former military and intelligence community employees, and informants or associates of intelligence community. Examples of people in ufology with these connections. In 1970s and 80s, Leonard Stringfield, Cecil B. Scott Jones, Dr. Jacques Vallée, William Moore, Richard Doty, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, Dr. Harold Puthoff, John Alexander, Dr. Christopher Green, Ron Pandolfi, and many others. Also organizations were working together like FUFOR, KUFOS, MUFON, and many other different organizations that were specialized for a certain area of, quote, research, unquote, expanding ufological industry to new areas not connected yet in the mainstream till 70s and 80s. It suggests a possibility of government-guided conspiracy of alien visitation cover-up as a distraction for other things, other events, 1970s and 1980s was era of big technological advancements in spy satellites technology, ASAT or anti-satellite weapons, stealth aircrafts technology and production, Star Wars program and Area 51, which helped building up new stories. All of this is important to know because that is the exact same period when supposed evidence and proof of alien involvement in Battle of Los Angeles came into ufological discussion. The event was connected with the term IPU or Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. UFO researchers managed to find out when this term came into the UFO lore. And interesting, it was 1978-1979, introduced by UFO researcher Todd Zeckel. Ufologist Kevin Randall wrote in his blog, quote, Bryant filed another request, and in 1978 the Army came back with what they termed an institutional memory, which was their way of saying they'd ask an older member of the team what he could remember. He said that in 1958 the UFO reports were processed by the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. This was set up in 1958 after the launch of the Soviet satellites in late 1957. According to the institutional memory, all the material gathered was sent to the Air Force in 1962. The IPU was abolished at that point. Unquote. Randall was referring to researcher Larry Bryant. So, the IPU was supposed to operate only between 1958 and 1962 because of the Russian satellite program. But we have no official confirmation that IPU ever existed. Files about Los Angeles battle incident and Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit were contributed to the most speculative ufological database called Majestic Documents. This collection is considered fake or misinformation by many researchers. This collection started growing in the first half of 1980s. Many people reported files to this collection, as before mentioned William Moore, which later confessed he collaborated with the CIA in disinformation spreading. We're gonna look at one file contributed by Timothy Cooper, which contributed a lot of Majestic Documents. This file was reported to Majestic Documents database in year 2000. Just a reminder, as we saw in part 2, witnesses from ufology of the Battle of Los Angeles event popped up in 2000s. So we can see chronological connection in dubious information spreading in entertainment industry. It is a letter from General Marshall to President Roosevelt dated March the 5th, 1942. The letter is in bad shape, so I will extract the important parts. Regarding the air raid over Los Angeles, it was learned by Army G2 that Rear Admiral Anderson recovered an unidentified airplane off the coast of California, with no bearing on conventional explanation. This headquarters has come to determination that the mystery airplanes are in fact not earthly, and according to secret intelligence sources, they are in all probability of interplanetary origin. As a consequence, I have issued orders to Army G2 that a special intelligence unit be created to further investigate the phenomenon and report any significant connection between recent incidents and those collected by the Director of the Office of Coordinator of Information. It was established that at the top of the letter, Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit was typed by a different typewriter at some later time. General Douglas MacArthur's statements about the interplanetary war were later connected to the Los Angeles event story. Some ufologists, such as Clifford Stone, claim that in 1942 there was no Foreign Technology Division, and that General MacArthur had his own recovery unit in Pacific Theater. Paper titled Foreign Technology Division that I found on the internet states following. Under various titles, the Foreign Technology Division traces its lineage directly from the establishment of the Technical Data Laboratory at Wright Field in December 1942. So if there is any truth in General Marshall's letter to President Roosevelt, from my point of view, that would indicate that some kind of adversary technology was recovered. But it could also mean that was just a disinformation to justify the official story that it were Japanese aircrafts. That would also make perfect sense because General Marshall was one of the people that crafted the story about Japanese planes for the Secretary Stimson with General DeWitt. Regarding there is no evidence of Japanese aircrafts, there is only one other possible explanation left, that they maybe recovered a Japanese balloon. This explanation is, in my point of view, very unlikely, because disinformation explanation fits all the other evidence. Nevertheless, Japanese balloon recovery is a possible explanation. After all, in 1944, Japanese had sent Fugo balloons to the west coast, which carried explosives. Japan started producing these Fugo balloons in 1943. Japan produced over 9,000 of these balloons. First one was intercepted in November 1944 by US Navy. This was supposedly first balloon that reached continental United States. Over 230 of these Fugo balloons were intercepted. Some were later found scattered on the ground. Although there is possibility that some kind of prototype was expected and recovered, I don't think this was the case in Battle of Los Angeles event. Back to Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. So let's repeat. In late 1970s and 1980s, UFO researchers were filing FOIA requests about Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. They were answered that no such files exist. Also, that the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit was disbanded in 1950s. Filing FOIA requests to Army Intelligence, they were answered the files were transferred to AFOSI, or Air Force Office of Special Investigations. After filing FOIA requests to AFOSI, they were answered the files were transferred to Project Blue Book. When Project Blue Book files were declassified, there was no information about Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit in the files. So Larry Bryant and others got very ambiguous answers. And this is the pattern we saw only recently. We can see very similar, if not the same, signs of procedure in so-called ATIP, or Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program story, where researchers like John Greenwald and Stephen Greenstreet proved that no such acronym program ever formally existed in government. But the acronym existed only in the community of people spreading information about the program. From this point of view, it is very reasonable that no such formal information exists. It exists in military, entertainment industry and public. but it also serves as disinformation tactic. This data exists only in intelligence disinformation world. And that seems to be the case as well with Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit and extraterrestrial involvement in the Battle of Los Angeles. But the industry propaganda of the event went on. For example, in 2011, ufological conference was held in honor of 69th anniversary of the Los Angeles event, organized in no other place than Santa Monica. Military experiencers and prominent figures in ufology like Charles Holt and Bob Salas were present. The official story was that it was a balloon, but air raid wardens were told it was an unidentified flying object, said Burns from MUFON, Mutual UFO Network. And the UFO conference or discussion was used as a promotion for new science fiction movie called Battle Los Angeles, which was released in the same year. In 1949, U.S. Artillery Association and in 1983, Office of Air Force History both established that a meteorological balloon was responsible for start and consequently all of the shooting. Air Force was officially criticizing US artillery for spending so many rounds on the targets that were so slow and evidently weren't Japanese air fighters. Japanese government confirmed they weren't sending any planes in that period of time. One article states that weather balloons and other balloons, several of these carrying flares, were an apparent response to the alarm of panic. Although no balloons were officially recovered, the army might have wanted to suppress embarrassing evidence of panic and misjudgment. But it would make sense if someone wanted to cover up balloons and flares, because the official story said it were Japanese aircrafts. That also makes sense because, as we heard in part 1, FBI went immediately investigating a person that supposedly saw clusters of flares being sent up to the sky. We're gonna look at the article called Hound Dogs on the Trail, the history of the 203rd CAB, Anti-Aircraft Artillery. They were stationed at the Douglas Aircraft Plant in Santa Monica. Quote, "The meteorological balloons reported up-to-date wind conditions for the gunners, so the 3-inch guns could have adjustments made if necessary before firing the guns. The meteorological balloons behind the raid consisted of 2 4-foot balloons the 203rd CAB Anti-Aircraft Artillery sent up from the Douglas Aircraft Plant. In order for the balloons to be properly tracked at night, the men had to put candles under each balloon, and the candlelight allowed the silver balloons to be visible at 25,000 feet. Lieutenant Melvin Tim, in charge of Battery D's meteorological balloons, received a call from Sergeant George Holmes during the raid, who said he could no longer track his balloon because someone had fired at it. Tim tried to track the balloon himself and could not as shells exploded near it. Tim sought out Colonel Ray Watson, the regimental commander, and told Watson that the balloons had taken fire. Watson ordered the men not to fire the guns, and he notified the control center of the situation, only to receive orders to shoot the balloons down. Colonel Watson, relieved of his command, returned home after the incident in March 1942 during the investigation of the air raid." End quote. Historian Jim Lewis states that Battery D, where Sergeant Holmes was stationed and released the balloons, was the only battery that did not shoot at the balloons. Afterwards, he was yelled at why his batteries didn't fire. He was told to keep his mouth shut and that 7 Japanese airplanes were involved. Otherwise, he would be put in jail. He was relieved of his duty in March, said Jim Lewis, so Colonel Watson and Sergeant Holmes were discharged from military. On the website theairraid.com, author writes, quote, "Early in the war, things were pretty scary, and the army was setting up coastal defenses. At one of the new radar stations near Santa Monica, the crew tried in vain to arrange for some planes to fly by so that they could test the system. As no one could spare the planes at the time, they hit upon a novel way to test the radar. One of the guys bought a bag of nickel balloons and then filled them with hydrogen, attached metal wires, and let them go, catching the offshore breeze. The balloons had the desired effect of showing up on the screens, proving the equipment was working. But after traveling a good distance offshore and to the south, the nightly onshore breeze started to push the balloons back towards the coastal cities. The coastal radars picked up the metal wires and the searchlights swung automatically on the targets, looking on the screens as aircraft heading for the city. The anti-aircraft started firing and the rest was history." Unquote. From the Daily News interview with one of the anti-aircraft artillerymen. In January 1942, Robert Watson Watt, the inventor of British chain-home radar system, paid a visit to United States. He was highly critical of United States detection system. From the book United States Army in World War II, The Technical Services, The Signal Corps, The Test, by George Raymer Thompson, Dixie B. Harris, Pauline M. Oakes, and Delaney Terrett. On 95th page it is written, quote, "The report was a bombshell, blasting Signal Corps radar equipment and radar training. It exploded also against the Army Air Force, the General Staff, the Western Defense Command, the Coast Artillery Corps, and everyone else in sight. Watson Watt, a brisk little Scotsman of alternating ability to charm and to infuriate, saw nothing good in American military radar. In essence, he criticized everything from operators, radar technology, the commands, everybody. What Robert Watson Watt argued was that American radars were incapable of detecting low-flying planes. We can only imagine the paranoia and panic that triggered in Western Defense Command. Was Los Angeles battle just a drill that proved that Robert Watson Watt was right? That American radars had difficulties even detecting low-flying balloons? Or was it just nerve jitters in combination with Battery D's unsuccessful balloon launching? And that consequently that showed signs of incompetence that Robert Watson Watt was warning about. From the book United States Army in World War II, The Western Hemisphere, Guarding the United States and its Outposts, by Stetson Kahn, Rose C. Engelman and Byron Fairchild. 82nd page, quote, "The most vital installations along this coast were military aircraft factories that had sprung up during the pre-war years at Los Angeles and San Diego in the south and at Seattle in the north. In December 1941, nearly half of the American military aircraft production and almost all of the heavy bomber output was coming from 8 plants in the Los Angeles area." Unquote. There were the biggest companies, like before mentioned Douglas, Lockheed, Northrop, and others. Interesting, in Burbank, where Vega and Lockheed aircraft plants were stationed, there were several buildings where advanced projects were going on. It was a birthplace of what was later known as Skunk Works. The plants were so important that after Pearl Harbor, they charged an expert called Colonel John F. Omar to disguise the plants. In the Operation Camouflage, he teamed up with designers and artists and producers from Hollywood. They covered up aircraft plants that they looked like Los Angeles suburbs from the air. Fake roofs, fake roads, fake trees, fake houses and actors. Actresses pretending to be housewives hanging laundry on the roof of a plant. Fake rubber automobiles, fake small farms with animals, fake barns. As one article states, with help of scenic designers, painters, art directors, landscape artists, animators, carpenters, lighting experts, and prop men from movie studios in Hollywood, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Disney Studios, 20th Century Fox, Paramount, Universal Pictures, and others, Colonel Omer began the task of disguising Marchfield and its neighborhood. Disguised areas were tested, and pilots couldn't identify camouflaged areas. It was a very sophisticated illusion. All this shows us how important and valuable were these plants. Some estimated that bombing of only one of the big plants would extend the war for 1 year. Certainly explains why General DeWitt was so nervous ordering all those drills. I will close this research presentation with a couple of sentences again from the history of the 4th AA Command, Western Defense Command, January 9th, 1942 to July 1st, 1945. General Goodman, in his report of the conference, summarized the lessons learned by the affair. 1. Rate of target travel should have been given more weight after opening fire in order to avoid excessive expenditure of ammunition. 2. Over-illumination of target violated searchlight SOP by putting altogether too many on target. Platoon commanders are responsible for seeing lights are put out in such cases so that the target will be properly illuminated. 3. A definite schedule for sending up meteorological balloons should be established, and under no circumstances should they be put up when guns are on a green status. 4. Responsibility for opening fire should rest with the anti-aircraft commander, not the controller. 5. Flares or supposed signals should be reported by group commanders to local ground force commanders only. Brigade headquarters should be informed only in unusual cases. In any event, General DeWitt commended the AA units of the 37th Brigade for their alertness, preparedness, and initiative during the affair, and this was endorsed down to the units by General Gardner and General Goodman. In the same manner, a commendation was directed to 4th Interceptor Command units through General Fickle and General Kepner. Brigadier General Kepner, commanding the 4th Interceptor Command on 14th March, in turn congratulated the personnel of the 4th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Command for the efficient and exemplary manner in which they had performed, and for this splendid example of efficient operation and high state of readiness to meet any situation. So it would appear all commanders were pleased, if not completely satisfied, with the conduct of this celebrated affair.